Elizabeth opened the door in the middle of the night, and what she found took her breath away. Her daughter Sarah was standing in front of her, staggering, her face bruised and her clothes torn. She barely managed to whisper her mother's name before collapsing in her arms. Elizabeth, who had seen so much violence in her career as a police officer, never imagined witnessing something like this within her own family. In that instant, professional instinct mixed with visceral pain. She picked up her daughter, her heart pounding, and carried her to the car without a second thought, knowing that every second could count. During the drive to the hospital, the tension was unbearable. Sarah lay unconscious, breathing shallowly, while Elizabeth drove with her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She felt rage, helplessness, and a fierce determination she couldn't remember ever having felt. She knew this wasn't just an isolated episode of violence. It was the culmination of years of silence and humiliation. As she watched her daughter's fragile body in the rearview mirror, she made a decision that would change the course of that night. She wouldn't allow Robert to lay a hand on her again, or continue manipulating her life. That early morning for Elizabeth, it was no longer just a matter of being a mother, but also of being the police officer who would fight to the bitter end for justice. At the hospital, Elizabeth paced back and forth as the doctors attended to Sarah. The smell of disinfectant, the sound of monitors, and the staff's rapid-fire voices made the seriousness of the situation even more evident. When she was finally allowed in, she saw her daughter lying there, dripping in her arm and staring into space. Sarah tried to speak, but the words came out broken amid tears and shame. It was at that moment that she confessed what Elizabeth feared. The beatings weren't new. They had been going on for years, and what had happened that night had been the worst of them. All. Elizabeth felt the ground crumble beneath her feet, but she also understood that there was no longer any room for doubt. With her experience in the police force, Elizabeth wasted no time. While Sarah rested under sedation, she requested the medical records, photographed each bruise with her own phone, and took notes on everything the medical staff described in the medical report. She knew these tests would be crucial, because Robert was a man accustomed to manipulation, presenting himself as an exemplary citizen and using his money to silence mouths. This time, there would be no escape. Elizabeth left the hospital with a heavy heart, but firmly determined that tonight would mark the beginning of a process that would not only save her daughter, but also expose him to everyone. At dawn, Elizabeth took Sarah to her own house, a place that had always been a refuge, but now felt like a makeshift barracks. She helped her shower carefully, avoiding the hot water causing more pain on her, bruises, and lent her clean clothes. Meanwhile, Elizabeth reviewed and re-examined the photos she had taken, organizing them in folders as if it were just another case at the police station. But this time it was different. The victim wasn't a stranger. It was her own daughter, and that filled her with a mixture of fury and protective tenderness that burned in her chest. Elizabeth knew Sarah's shame was a huge obstacle. Seeing her duck her head every time Robert was mentioned was like facing an invisible enemy. Aware that she needed more evidence, Elizabeth recalled Camilla's neighbor's security camera, which pointed toward the main street. Wasting no time, she went to her house and explained the situation. Camilla, moved by Sarah's condition, didn't hesitate to hand over the recordings. There, among the grainy images from the early morning, Robert could clearly be seen violently pushing Sarah against the car before she managed to escape. That evidence was pure gold, the piece that could put an end to any doubt about what had happened. Elizabeth returned with the file on a USB stick, feeling that each step brought her closer to justice, even if the road was still fraught with pitfalls and resistance. Elizabeth spent much of the day between calls and filing paperwork. She contacted a trusted colleague at the police station, someone who knew her integrity and could guide her without leaking anything to Robert, who had contacts in various sectors. She prepared a dossier with Camilla's medical reports, photographs, and video from her camera. Meanwhile, Sarah barely spoke, remaining on the sofa with a blanket over her, avoiding looking in the mirror. Every silence from her daughter was a reminder of the psychological damage that marriage had also left behind. Elizabeth reached out with small gestures, a cup of tea, a hand on her shoulder, but she knew the recovery would be slow. That afternoon, Sarah broke her silence and confessed that Robert had another woman. certain Denise, who not only knew about the situation, but also occasionally mocked her, encouraging the violence. Elizabeth listened with suppressed rage, because now everything fell into place. The humiliation wasn't just physical, it had also been a cruelly planned moral torture. It was at that moment that she decided she had to keep an eye on Robert herself. If she had endured years of service risking her life on the streets, she would not hesitate now to unmask the man who had destroyed her daughter's life. That determination gave her new strength for what was to come. That same night, Elizabeth left in her car without saying anything to Sarah, who was sleeping exhausted. She knew Robert's movements, and after a few hours of waiting, she saw him leaving a restaurant holding hands with Denise. Rage tightened in her stomach, but she resisted the urge to confront him right then and there. Instead, she took out her phone and calmly recorded the scene, capturing every knowing gesture, every shameless caress. It wasn't just proof of infidelity. It was confirmation that Robert was leading a double life while destroying his daughter. Elizabeth saved the video and returned home, convinced that the footage would serve to reveal her son-in-law's true colors. Reviewing the recording later, along with the other evidence she had already gathered, she felt for the first time that she was building a solid case. However, she also knew that Robert was cunning and wouldn't give up easily. Sarah, still fragile, hesitated to go any further. She feared retaliation, social judgment, and the accusing glares of neighbors. Elizabeth sat beside her, and while she didn't force words, her presence made it clear that she wouldn't abandon her. Deep down, she was prepared to fight whatever resources Robert could deploy, because this battle was no longer just a legal one. It was a matter of dignity and survival. As the days passed, Elizabeth began to notice inconsistencies in some of the documents Robert had had Sarah sign in the past. Amid inheritance papers and legal proceedings, she discovered he had forged his signature to transfer land belonging to the family, land that was a memento of Sarah's grandfather. This betrayal of her estate was the final blow for Elizabeth. It wasn't just domestic violence or infidelity, it was a direct attack on the family legacy. Her hands shaking with indignation, she photographed each document, aware that such evidence would only sink her further. Her anger was no longer just personal. It was also professional because she knew she was facing a serious crime. Sarah, upon finding out, broke down. She felt used, deceived, as if everything she had built with him had been a sham. Elizabeth hugged her tightly, trying to instill in her the security she couldn't find within herself. It was then that she decided to call Attorney James, an upright man who had worked with her on previous police cases. She told him everything, from the violence to the corruption, and he agreed to represent Sarah. Elizabeth understood she was entering a long war, but looking at her daughter, with her broken gaze and trembling voice, she promised herself never to back down. That night, as she reviewed the evidence once again, she knew the battle would be public and painful, but also that it was the only way to recover Sarah's life and dignity. The day of the first hearing was fraught with tension. Robert appeared impeccable, wearing an expensive EU suit and a rehearsed smile intended to convince everyone of his innocence. At his side, his lawyer spoke confidently, repeating his version that Sarah was unstable and that the accusations were the product of jealousy and resentment. Elizabeth, from across the room, watched him with a mixture of repulsion and serenity. She knew that mask wouldn't last long, because every piece of evidence she had gathered was there, ready to be revealed. Sarah, on the other hand, trembled silently, her gaze fixed on the floor, fighting the fear of facing her attacker again. Attorney James presented the medical reports, photographs of the bruises, and the security camera video. The courtroom filled with murmurs as the images appeared on the screen, showing Robert violently pushing Sarah. For a moment, his once confident face twisted, though he quickly tried to regain his composure. Elizabeth felt a quiet satisfaction as she watched the truth begin to emerge, but she was also on guard. She knew Robert had resources for manipulation, bought witnesses, and the ability to turn things around. The battle was far from over, but this first crack in his facade was a triumph that strengthened both of their resolves. In the ensuing hearings, Elizabeth witnessed how Robert tried to manipulate everyone. She brought acquaintances who testified in his favor, describing him as an exemplary man, a devoted father, and an impeccable professional. Even some neighbors appeared confused, unable to imagine what was really going on behind the walls of their home. Sarah, her voice breaking, recounted what she had experienced for years, but each word seemed to tear at her throat. Elizabeth, sitting beside her, kept her gaze steady, as if she were silently draining her strength. She knew that credibility was fragile, and that it only took one turn for everything to turn against her daughter. It was then that Denise, the mistress, appeared, summoned to testify. No one expected her to speak against Robert, but the turn of events was surprising. Under pressure, and perhaps driven by fear of being implicated, she admitted that she had witnessed episodes of violence and had even encouraged him on some occasions. Her testimony changed the course of the trial. Robert, who until then had maintained his impeccable facade, exploded in the courtroom, standing up and shouting that it was all a conspiracy. That outburst of fury in front of the judge and those present was the mistake that sealed his fate. Elizabeth watched with a mixture of relief and sadness, aware that the mask was finally falling. The judge, after hearing all the statements and reviewing the evidence, ordered immediate protective measures for Sarah and the annulment of the fraudulent transfers of the family lands. He also decided that Robert should be held in pretrial detention while the criminal proceedings for violence and fraud proceeded. The courtroom fell silent, broken only by the sound of the gavel hitting the table. Elizabeth felt she could breathe calmly for the first time in a long time. Sarah, though tears still streaming down her face, looked up and looked at her mother, as if acknowledging that thanks to her, she was alive and standing. If you've read this far, please tell me where in the world you're reading from. It's always inspiring to know how far stories of overcoming challenges like this one travel. As they left the courthouse, Elizabeth took her daughter's hand and felt that such a simple gesture symbolized a new beginning. Outside, the cold air blew hard, but it was no longer as stifling as the shadow they'd lived under for years. The road to recovery was just beginning. Sarah would still have to face her fears, nightmares, and the slow rebuilding of her self-esteem. But that day had proven that justice could be made visible, and that together, they could weather any storm. The following weeks were a difficult process for Sarah. The nights were filled with nightmares in which she relived Robert's screams and blows. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, and Elizabeth would immediately rush in to reassure her. She knew that emotional scars don't heal with a court ruling. It was then that she decided to take Sarah to psychological therapy, accompanying her to each session, even though Sarah was initially hesitant to open up to anyone else. Little by little, the young woman began to speak, to release words that had been trapped for years and that weighed like invisible chains. Amidst the routine of appointments and medication, Elizabeth sought to restore small slivers of normalcy to her daughter. She encouraged her to cook together, go for walks in the neighborhood park, and rediscover the pleasure of simple things like sipping coffee in the sun. Every shy smile that appeared on Sarah's face was a silent triumph. Elizabeth, hardened by years of police service, understood that the real battles weren't always fought in court, but in the intimacy of everyday life, where rebuilding self-confidence required patience, love, and perseverance. Over time, Sarah began to regain small routines that had previously seemed impossible. She dared to return to her old job, even if only for a few hours, and found unexpected refuge in the support of some colleagues. Elizabeth would accompany her to the entrance, waiting in the car, as if she still needed to ensure no one would harm her again. It wasn't easy to shake off that feeling of constant threat, but every workday Sarah managed to complete was a step forward. Her confidence was still fragile, but simply feeling useful again gave her back some dignity. At home, the mother-daughter relationship grew stronger than ever. Elizabeth was not only the protector, she also became the confidant and witness to every small achievement. There were days when Sarah would slip back, feeling weak and broken, but she no longer did so alone. Her mother's constant presence was a reminder that there was a future beyond the pain. And as Elizabeth watched those developments, she understood that true justice lay not just in seeing Robert behind bars, but in witnessing her daughter, little by little, lift her head and live again without fear. One Sunday morning, Elizabeth convinced Sarah to visit the land they had reclaimed after the fraud was annulled. They walked together through the land, which was neglected but still a symbol of the family. It was an emotional moment for Sarah. The land represented the memory of her grandfather, and knowing that Robert had tried to take it from her filled her with rage, but also with relief to see it back in her hands. Elizabeth assured her that in time they could restore it and give it a new use, perhaps as a space for healing, a place where wounds could be transformed into firm roots. That same day, Sarah confessed that she was still afraid of going out alone, of running into someone who might remind her of Robert, or one of his lies circulating in the city. Elizabeth listened calmly and reminded her that every step, no matter how small, was an act of courage. She suggested that she keep a journal where she would record her progress and emotions as a way to gradually free herself from the internal burden. Sarah accepted, and although at first they were only short, self-doubting sentences, over time they grew into entire pages that depicted a real process of reconstruction. The months passed, and although Robert saw shadow remained present in some of the people's malicious comments, Sarah learned not to be defined by outside opinions. She began to get involved in a support group for women who had gone through similar situations, and there she found a space where she could speak without fear or shame. Elizabeth sometimes attended, sitting silently at the back of the room, proud to see her daughter share her experience and encourage other women. That circle became a new family, a reminder that they weren't alone and that resilience could be shared. And if this story has touched you in any way, share it with someone who needs it. You never know how far a word of support can go. Elizabeth, for her part, also found profound learning. She understood that despite her police experience, there were emotional aspects that had overwhelmed her as a mother. However, that mix of unconditional love and discipline was what sustained Sarah when she needed it most. The court process had been important, but the truly transformative thing was happening in the everyday, in every walk, every late-night conversation, and every smile that blossomed again. Over time, life began to return to a certain degree of normalcy. Elizabeth returned to her routine in the police force, although she never stopped looking after Sarah. Her daughter, for the first time in years, allowed herself to plan for the future, without the constant shadow of fear. She spoke of returning to the studies she had abandoned, and of building an independent life, free from the chains Robert had imposed on her. Elizabeth listened with pride, aware that this courage was the fruit of a long struggle, both in the courts and in her heart. On one of those quiet afternoons, sitting at the kitchen table, Sarah thanked her mother for not leaving her alone in her darkest moment. Elizabeth didn't respond with words. She simply took her hand and held it tightly. For her, there was no greater victory than seeing her daughter with a clear gaze and a confident voice. She understood that true justice wasn't measured solely by court rulings, but by the ability to walk again without fear, to laugh without guilt, and to rebuild the broken pieces of a life marked by violence. The day they confirmed Robert would remain in pretrial detention while the fraud and violence charges proceeded, Elizabeth felt a period of time had finally come to a close. She would no longer have to fear him showing up at her doorstep to intimidate them, or manipulating people in his favor. That news was like a weight lifted from her chest, and although she knew there was still a judicial path to follow, it was a huge relief for both of them. Sarah celebrated silently, with stifled tears, as if she could finally let out years of pent-up tension. The rebuilding continued slowly, but more steadily. Sarah began to sleep better, to go out alone occasionally, and to look people in the eye without lowering her head. Elizabeth observed these changes with uncontainable pride, aware that this wasn't her triumph, but rather the result of her daughter's inner strength. They had moved from darkness to a realm where shadows still lingered, but where the light was growing stronger. And in the midst of this new phase, they both understood there was no turning back. What they had experienced would remain as a scar, but also as a reminder that together they could overcome whatever seemed impossible. One afternoon, while walking together in the park, Sarah stopped in front of a group of children playing and flashed a smile Elizabeth hadn't seen in years. It was a simple gesture, but for her mother, it confirmed that something inside her was healing. Sarah told her that for the first time she was curious about the future, that she was no longer living solely in terms of fear or mistrust. Elizabeth listened attentively, treasuring that phrase, because behind those words lay a battle won against hopelessness. Upon returning home, Elizabeth took all: the case documents out of a drawer, the photos, the medical reports, the camera evidence, and the fraudulent papers Robert had manipulated. She looked at them one last time before filing them away in a locked folder. They were evidence of pain, but also symbols of resilience. She wouldn't destroy them because they represented the history of struggle they had lived together. However, she no longer needed to have them on her desk to feel in control. Now the priority wasn't the case or the trial, but life itself, and that life was beginning to be rebuilt day by day with firm and conscious steps. Elizabeth began to notice that Sarah was speaking with more confidence, even on topics that had previously paralyzed her. She dared to share part of her story in the support group, and she did so without lowering her voice or averting her gaze. Elizabeth, sitting in the audience, felt a lump in her throat as she listened to her daughter describe the years of manipulation and violence and how she had found the strength to emerge from that nightmare. It was a proud moment, but also a relief, because it proved that Sarah was no longer just a victim, but a woman who was finding her voice. In the following days, Elizabeth found her daughter more active, helping with chores around the house and resuming personal projects. There were relapses, yes, nights when the nightmares returned or the memory of Robert made her tremble, but they no longer defeated her as before. Elizabeth understood that true overcoming was not erasing the past, but learning to live with it without it dictating every step. As she watched her write in her diary and plan what she wanted to study, she knew the most important battle had been won. Sarah had regained hope, and with it, the real possibility of building a full life. With the arrival of spring, Sarah decided to change her bedroom decor, something that seemed insignificant but had enormous symbolic value. She painted the walls a light color, hung old photographs of happy moments, and boxed up everything that reminded her of her life with Robert. Elizabeth helped her, observing how the process was, in reality, an emotional cleansing. Each object that left the room was like a weight off her shoulders. Seeing her daughter making decisions, even small ones, was a reflection of her regaining control of her life. One weekend, Elizabeth organized a family meal to which she invited her siblings and nephews, hoping Sarah would feel the warmth of the bonds that held her together again. At first, she was nervous, fearing awkward questions, but what she received were hugs, laughter, and words of encouragement. That evening, amidst the table filled with homemade dishes and clashing voices, Sarah smiled effortlessly again. Elizabeth looked at her in silence, convinced that this was the true triumph, not only having brought Robert to justice, but having returned to her everyday life without fear, surrounded by people who truly loved her. The following months brought a calm that at first seemed strange. Sarah was no longer alert to every noise in the street or every unknown call on the phone. Elizabeth, although still instinctively alert, learned to relax a little, trusting that justice was being served and that Robert would no longer have power over them. There was a new rhythm in the house: leisurely breakfasts, leisurely walks, and conversations that didn't revolve around grief, but around projects and dreams. That normalcy, so simple, was the greatest gift they could both receive. Elizabeth, however, knew that emotional scars don't disappear overnight. That's why, every time she saw Sarah hesitate or regress, she reminded her how far they had come together. She encouraged her to acknowledge her achievements, no matter how small, because she understood that healing comes step by step. At night, when she was alone in the kitchen, she would sometimes replay everything she'd experienced. From that early morning when Sarah had knocked on her door to this calm present, and she always came to the same conclusion: what had saved them wasn't just legal justice, but the unbreakable love between mother and daughter. A year later, Sarah was a different person. She had resumed her studies, was more confident in public speaking, and had even begun helping other women in the support group, sharing her experience as a way of giving hope. Elizabeth watched her with admiration, knowing that behind every word of encouragement lay a past filled with pain, but also enormous courage. Seeing her daughter grow into someone capable of transforming her story into strength for others was a reward no court ruling could match. One quiet evening, while sharing coffee in the kitchen, Sarah told Elizabeth that she finally felt she could breathe without fear. Elizabeth looked at her silently, her eyes shining, aware that this was the real closure of everything they had experienced. Robert would continue to face his trials, but they were no longer trapped in his shadow. They now had an open future, full of possibilities, and most importantly, they had regained their dignity and freedom. Elizabeth smiled, understanding that the true victory lay not within the walls of the courtroom, but in the life they had rebuilt together, step by step, day after day. At the final hearing, Elizabeth and Sarah attended without the tension they had felt at first. It was no longer a matter of proving anything, but of hearing how justice took its course. The judge upheld the protective measures and confirmed that Robert would face firm charges of violence and fraud. Sarah listened calmly, without tears or trembling, as if she had finally learned to look straight ahead without fear. Elizabeth looked at her out of the corner of her eye, proud, because she understood that this gesture was worth more than any words. Her daughter had regained control of her life. As they left the courthouse, they walked together in the sunshine, unhurried and without looking back. The world hadn't stopped to wait for them, but they had managed to stop the seemingly endless cycle of pain. Elizabeth, in her police uniform and with a mother's heart, felt that the most difficult mission of her life had been accomplished: to protect her daughter not only with the law, but with unconditional love. Sarah, with a shy smile, knew this was the true beginning. What they had faced would be marked forever, but now they were certain that they could live free with dignity and without fear.